Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about scoring around the NHL. We're a little over 10% of the way into the season, so we can see some trends, and we can take a look at the scoring as it compares now to how it was in seasons past. But I want to look all the way back to when I started watching hockey, which was 80-81. And I'm not going to go through all of these numbers because that just gets to be a little bit much. So I'm not going to get into all of the numbers. I just want to go through the trends. So when I started watching hockey, your average hockey team would score 3.84 goals per game. So a game that was 4-3, that was a pretty good game. 6-5, fun game, fun to watch. If it was 2-1, wow, what a nail biter. Very rare nail biter that you saw that. In shutouts, weren't very many shutouts. The league leaders in shutouts. During those years, I remember you'd have like guys with maybe 3. Sometimes a guy with 2 would be up amongst the leaders in the league. Like, it was rare. And it was not unusual to see a team go a full season with maybe a shutout or maybe none. And it wasn't considered to be a big deal. Now, if a team goes a full season without a shutout or without being shut out, it's kind of a big deal. It's far more common now to see shutouts. And what's interesting is it feels like we've had more shutouts this year than the last few years, and yet scoring hasn't really dropped off that much. So we ended up peaking in 81-82, where it was 4.01 goals scored per game by a team, 873 save percentage, and it's pond hockey. Like, as much as people complain about the goaltenders, go back and watch those highlights. Look at the defense. Yeah, there was no structure to the defense. All the defensive systems would come in later. The Montreal Canadiens were the pioneers. The New Jersey Devils took it up under Jacques Lemaire. Eventually, defense wins the game. The one thing that I noticed in the 80s was the team that was, one of the better defensive teams in the league usually was the one that won the Stanley Cup at the end. The team that played the better defense. So that defense wins championships. Even in that era where there wasn't much defense, I noticed the teams that at least made that effort and did their best to keep the puck out of the net usually did pretty well in the playoffs. Especially if they were, during the regular season, preparing themselves for when the scoring was going to drop a little bit in the playoffs. So it stays in that range of 3.8, 3.8, 3, like the fours there. There's 3.94, 3.8, 3.9, 3.6. So 3.6 is your first drop off. The save percentage goes to 880. That's the 86-87 season. But Gretzky is still your leading scorer. So from 80-81 to 86-87, Gretzky's the leading scorer every year. And there were years that his assists were higher than the second leading point producer in the entire National Hockey League. So when I hear people talking about, well, Gretzky, today's day and age, he wouldn't have been as good. He had more points than the next, or he had more assists than the next guy had points. So if he had come up in today's era, I think Gretzky still would have been pretty good. Sure, he wouldn't have put up 208, 205, 215 points, but he still would have had excellent point totals. And as McDavid showed last year, you can still hit 150 points in this era. So 87-88, we see Mario Lemieux come around. Scoring goes up a little bit. At least Mario Lemieux becomes your leading scorer. He'd been in the league a few years at that point. 88-89, Lemieux, the closest he gets to 200 points. He ends up with 199 that year. Save percentage is still low, and the goals stay about the same. But notice that with each decade, I changed the color. And 90-91, as we hit the new decade, scoring goes down to 3.46 goals per team. So your average has dropped now to 3.46. Save percentage comes up to 886. Gretzky's number one points production, though, still 163. That's still a very good season. 91-92, it's 3.48. Goes to 3.63. And then in 93-94, we start to see the drop-off in scoring. So 93-94, of course, remembered for the fantastic Stanley Cup final between the Rangers and the Canucks. But you could tell something was changing in the NHL. So 3.24 goals per game, 895 save percentage. So the goaltending is getting better, but so's the defense in front of that goaltending. Gretzky leads the league in points that year with 130. That's the last time he leads the league in points. So 94-95, this is a lockout shortened season, but scoring drops to 2.99. The first time goals have been below 3 per game. On average per team in the time I watched hockey. And the save percentage goes up to 901, and it felt like a lot of games were just chess matches. Now, some people really appreciated that, and we started seeing bigger defense. We started seeing a lot more hooking and holding and obstruction. So when the defense came in, that's what it was a lot of the time was. You're not getting to the net because you'll have a guy like Mike Rathje standing in front of it, and if you try to get to it, good luck. Hooking, holding, slashing, all of it. So Lindros and Yager are the leading scorers that year. They tie for the league lead with 70 points. 95, 96, we do see scoring go back up a little bit to 3.14 goals per game, but then it drops below 3. And it doesn't get back up above 3 goals per game per team for a long time. And what happens during this period is the game gets kind of stagnant. And it really becomes a bit of a challenge to watch some of these games because the scoring's down, which some people really like. The save percentage comes up. And by the time we reach that final season before the lockout of 03-04, scoring's down to 2.57 goals per game per team. And save percentage is up to 911. Marty St. Louis is the leading scorer that year with 94 points. So we no longer have a 200-point producer. We don't even have a 100-point producer. Yager led the league with 96 points in 99-2000. Iginla led the league in 96 points in 01-02. And you could just see that it was getting more and more difficult to play and to get through that checking. So the NHL realizes they have a problem. So 04-05, we talk about how the NHL took that season out because they wanted a salary cap. And we can all hate on the fact that we lost an entire season because of this fight over a salary cap. But they did get something right. They allowed the 2-line pass. So what defenses had started doing with the center line was, well, you know that they can't pass from their own zone past the red line. So you don't have to worry about a home run pass or a stretch pass beyond the red line because that's going to be considered offside. So you can sit your defense at that red line. You know they're not going around you. And there were teams that were employing a style of hockey that we call the trap that was broken by that 2-line pass being allowed. The NHL allowing that 2-line pass for the first time in ages means that you no longer have to just station everybody at center ice. Now you have to worry about that pass to your blue line. And it broke down some of that defense. In 05-06, the first year that the 2-line pass is allowed, we see a change. 3.08 goals per game per team, meaning it went up by about half a goal per game. Save percentage drops by 10 points from 911 to 901. And your leading scorer that year is Joe Thornton, who split his time between Boston and San Jose and ended up with 125 points, which was the highest point total in a season for a player since Yager in 98-99 with 127. So it's a real change. What's interesting is, in 1943, they introduced the red line, in part because they wanted to cut down on offsides, and they felt it helped the creativity of the game. Now, I've seen some proponents for bringing back the red line and getting rid of the 2-line pass. I've seen articles. I couldn't get there. I can't get there because I know we would see a return of trapping hockey. It'd be different. I mean, the players are bigger and faster now than they were 20 years ago, but we would see a return of some form of trapping hockey. And the NHL, you don't get very many highlights out of trapping hockey. We didn't have highlight reel packages of all the hooking and holding and all the obstruction that was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we see the scoring above 3 goals per game, but it drops again in 06-07 to 2.95. It drops down to all the way to 2.71 here, but it was in the 2.7 region from 2010, 2011, all the way till 2016, 2017, which is where the channel comes in, right? And then the scoring starts going up. So the scoring has gone up. 2017, 2018, you go up to 2.97 goals per game. So as the NHL continues to crack down on obstruction, as the NHL continues to say, you know what, we're going to call the rule book, which, again, they could still do some more work on. But you see the difference it makes. It allows for the creative players in the league to go out there and perform. And that's what we pay to watch. We don't pay to watch Connor McDavid on a fantastic break to the net, just get mugged at the net, and then go, well, that's a hockey play. Which, back in the early 2000s, is kind of what happens, right? Where you say, well, that's kind of a mugging, but that's how the league works, because they weren't calling a lot of the obstruction stuff. So we see that over the last, what are we at now, from 2015, 2016 until this year, 100-point producer every season. We should see multiple 100-point producers this season. And it feels like that's a really good measure, right? 100-point seasons. I remember in the 80s, I would talk about this guy's got this many, this guy's got this many, and it was a nice dividing line. And then eventually, by the time you reach 2014, 2015, where Jamie Benn leads in points with 87, we're no longer talking about a really elite player being a 100-point producer. It kind of becomes 70. Gets to the point where it's like, hey, if that guy gets 70 points, that's pretty darn good in this day and age. But the NHL has been pretty good at adapting And it feels like now with the rules as they are. Keep in mind that before the season, for a while there, we were seeing, okay, now they're cracking down on this. All right, now they're cracking down on this. It's boarding, it's hooking, it's slashing. This year, there hasn't been a change in what they're officiating. Now, we can all get into the discussion of the officiating being as it is and everything. But this year's scoring so far, we've got 3.15 goals scored per game, the 905 save percentage. Last year, the goals per game was 3.18. The year before was 3.14. That is 3 years in a row, and 5 of the last 6 years where the scoring has been above 3 goals per game per team. Those are numbers not seen since the early 90s. So the game has definitely changed. It's become more exciting. Yes, we are now seeing a league where the enforcers have kind of been taken out. And part of the reason is because those players who, gave it their all and they were sometimes the most popular players in the league, they didn't take a regular shift. And so while it was seen as not really hurting the team in the late 90s, early 2000s, once you get into this speed and skill game, it absolutely does hurt your team if you have a forward that cannot take a regular shift. If you have somebody whose skating speed is significantly slower, or they can't make the turns, or they're likely to take a lot of penalties, and you're likely to be shorthanded. And so that all has to be taken into consideration. So I know I see people talking about, I'd like to see them come back. The game has changed. I don't see it happening because you just don't have a league now where you can have somebody who isn't able to take that regular shift. You can have players who can drop the gloves and take a regular shift. Tom Wilson's able to do that as an example. But really, those players are rare. You might have one on a lot of the teams in the league, but you're going to have some that don't have any. I don't think that necessarily translates to a lack of toughness. I've talked about Ryan Lindgren many, many times over. The amount of times he gets injured and just comes back into the game, and that's why I've decided he's a cyborg. There are other cyborgs in the league too, guys who will get pasted into the boards 15 times a game and just come right back. Lawson Crouse in that last game for Arizona, he gets absolutely blasted into the boards. Doesn't it into the board? Anyways, Crouse ends up going off. His shoulder's just hanging there, and it looks like he could be out for weeks. He's back for his next shift. So my guess is, my shoulder's out of the socket. I'll go whack it into that door. I'll whack it into I don't know. I'll do something to put it back in the socket, and I'll come back in. Give me a couple of minutes. And I would not be overly surprised if there are players in the league who can do that. So I don't buy into the idea that just because they're not dropping the gloves as much as they did 20 years ago, that translates to them not being tough players and not being capable of defending themselves. I think it's interesting right now. We've got Jack Hughes and Elias Pettersson leading the league in scoring, both with 20 points. Hughes, at the time I'm recording this, currently hurt. But it definitely looks like we're going to see another season with a lot of 100-point producers. I think last year was like 10 or 11, somewhere in that region, which is getting into 80s style numbers. But I think there's a good balance. Back in the 80s, it was all offense, right? So now we have the offense, but we also had shutouts last night. We had some really good defensive performances too. So this is why when I look at where the game is now, and I look at these trends and I look at these numbers, I say to myself, okay, we're in the era of McDavid. He has led the league in scoring 5 times. McDavid, of course, right now nowhere near the league leader in scoring, but as long as he gets back to 100% health, and I don't think he's there right now, he can go on a run and he can get there. But still, we have Jack Hughes, very supremely talented. Obviously, Pettersson tied for the league lead in points. And most teams have 1 or 2 superstar players, which again, when you look back to the 80s, wasn't always the case. You might have some guys who are good point producers, but superstars, And it feels like now we're in a league where there's a lot of superstar players and there's a lot of other guys coming up. So I think right now, the era that we're living in, I think for me, for the time I've watched hockey, is the best era of watching hockey. I've said it in videos. I've also said it in the comment section multiple times, and I mean it. I think this is the best era of watching hockey that I've seen in my lifetime, and I feel very fortunate that I get to stand here every day and talk about the National Hockey League and its product, because while we may not agree with some of the league decisions and on some of the things that they do, the product on the ice is excellent. And I think the product on the ice bails them out a lot of the time when they do something rather short-sighted or silly. But at any rate, I think the product's the best on the ice it's ever been. I know there are people who'd like to see it go back to the way it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm not there. I think there's some supremely talented players right now, and I want to see the skill rewarded, because it is the skill that gets into the highlight reel. It is the skill that wins people over. I don't know how many times I've seen where they'll bring in some celebrity, they'll to tie in, they'll give them a jersey and sit them down at ice level. And they always say the same thing. They always talk about the speed of the game and appreciating how fast it is. And just appreciating how much training and skill there is that's involved with becoming a hockey player. And whenever somebody's a new fan, that's what I suggest. Get tickets to a hockey game at a lower level. Does not have to be National Hockey League. Junior hockey is fast. American Hockey League is as well. The skill is on display. So we're very lucky to have that at the NHL level. I think we have that at almost every level of hockey now. So it's an exciting time to be a fan. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And I want to say in closing, so this is what's considered the live puck era. Then it turned into the dead puck era. Now we've got the salary cap era. But I do wonder what we're going to start referring to this as. Do we call it the skill era? Where it's not just offensive skill, there's defensive skill, there's goaltending. It's just the skilled players, it feels like, are standing out now more than they ever did before. But let me know your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.